This is David Pietrusza, and you're watching the Break It Down show.
I love having you on because you write these incredible books. And today the book is Gangsterland. And it seems to me in my head, because I get busy doing things and I know you get busy, but it seems like every 3 months you're writing a book.
No, but I mean, to come out with a book a year, uh,
Yeah,
is sort of unusual,
it
and
is.
that's what I've done in this case. And this book came together pretty quickly. I
Mm.
was quite amazed by it, particularly since it was not on my radar screen when the idea started. I was on with a TV host the other day, and she said, "I didn't expect you to write this book." I said, "Neither did I," but it just happened. It's like. If I may quote Uncle Tom's Cabin, which is
Yeah,
always dangerous, like Topsy, it just growed. It just
yeah.
growed.
When you look at your collection of books, if I was to read the titles, I can mix up the order and you'd be like, what is David doing? But there is a theme, right? Like there's New York City's a theme.
New York City is a big theme. Yeah.
Sure. Baseball, which brings in the mob,
Mm-hmm.
which brings in presidents, and all these things, man, they tie together.
Rothstein, the Arnold Rothstein, the character, the individual certainly did, and he led to his own biography,
Yeah.
and ultimately to this book because he's the centerpiece of it and the centerpiece of crime in Manhattan in the jazz age and before the jazz age.
Yeah.
So yeah, and the idea with the Rothstein book was people said, well, because of the subtitle, and what he's most famous for is fixing the 1919 World Series. So people would say to me, "So you wanted to write a book on baseball?" And it's like, I'd already written books on baseball, but what I wanted to do was write a book on New York City in the 1920s, and I faced two problems. One, which portion of the 20s should I take? And two, why should anyone trust this broken down baseball writer to do such a book, to do like a straight history sort of book? But I've been trained for straight history. I had a master's and a degree in American history. And I stumbled across a bio, a rather obscure bio of Mayor Walker, Mayor Gentleman Jimmy Walker, and I found this Rothstein guy just popping up over and over again. And I said, well, maybe this is it. And it turned out to be it.
It's fascinating in this era of American lore, especially in New York City, it just never stops paying off. I mean, we look at, like, if you look at Mario Puzo's work, right, and he talks about the need for these Italian families to have their own governmental structure because they didn't feel supported or regulated by the state in a way that made sense, and so they took care of this themselves. But they're not the only group to feel that and to mob themselves up to look after one another.
No, I mean this is the classic era of the Jewish mob. And I was just recently contacted by Israeli TV to help them with a documentary they're thinking of
Mm.
on the Jewish mob. And, it's not just New York City. You've got the Purple Gang in Detroit, and I think it's Mo Dalitz in Cleveland, and then of course they spread out to Vegas and all that. So yeah, and the Irish before them, but before Prohibition, before the Jazz Age, before Rothstein and the Five Families and all that, it's kind of penny ante thuggish
Mm.
stuff.
Mhm.
Organized crime ain't organized. It's kind of like, so you wouldn't want anything bad to happen to your push cart, would you? No, I wouldn't. And but it grows from that, and it grows exponentially in that era, and in large part thanks to Rothstein because he is the middleman between the gangsters, the thugs, the bootleggers, the speakeasies, the police, and the political structure of Tammany Hall, the Democratic organization running Manhattan and running it profitably.
Yeah, uh, staying with the mob theme, as things do start to settle, and you have post World War I and post influenza pandemic things start to sort out, coupled with the prohibition movement. There's a lot of things that kind of ignite. There's money, there's action, there's a law that everybody wants to get around. Is that what makes the jazz age so interesting?
Well, that and you've got the 18th Amendment
Mhm.
and you've got the 19th Amendment. You've got the women, the beginning of sort of women's liberation, and the flappers and the young women going out, and then some of the older women going out and having a hell of a time in the if you had the money, and
Yeah.
if you had the looks, or if you had the combination of both, it could work for you, and you'd go out to all these nightclubs. And the larger, what you see in Manhattan at that time is they used to have these things called lobster palaces, which would be the huge, very ornate, very expensive, very elegant restaurants, often with ballroom, featuring ballroom dancing. There was a big ballroom dancing craze in the teens. Those things all shut down because without the legal sale of booze, as I guess is the case today, you don't see restaurants that profitable. You got to have a liquor license to make a profit. So they die and they're replaced by the speakeasy, some of which have, different sorts of entertainment. They might have a little chorus line, or they might have somebody like Jimmy Durante or Helen Morgan, the torch singers of that era. So they continue. You see that the West 50s in New York are just loaded with one speakeasy after another. It's like, oh, building by building. And then when the police shut them down, they just sprout up again with different owners, or maybe the same owners.
Mhm.
And it's a time of when people are in flux. You also see people, you see the buildings, you see the having different aspects of this narrative uh, going in one direction or another. It might be show business, or the mob, or a murder, or a jewel robbery, or showgirls, or whatever. And people flitting between one world or another. Most of course Rothstein, but also you take a guy like George Raft. Our older viewers may recall George Raft, who was a fairly big gangster type movie star in the 1930s. Kind of famous now for turning down all sorts of roles that he shouldn't have. So
Yeah.
we don't remember him as much as, say, Humphrey Bogart, but he turned down a role, and then Humphrey Bogart would show up in it and turn it into a big hit. He actually was a gangster, or was very close to gangsters. He was close to Oni the Killer Madden. And a
Mhm.
guy with a nickname like that, yeah, he was a bit shady. He was in Sing Sing. He murdered somebody, at least one person, got convicted for it. And Raft, who became a movie star, was a big pal of his. He helped him and his pals um, fix a number of prize fights. And they were big backers of Primo Carnera, who was the world heavyweight champion at one time. Raft, aside from motion pictures and helping fix prize fights, um, and being a pal of Madden, was also a great dancer, if you can believe it or not. He was perhaps the best Charleston dancer in America, and made a good sum of money dancing in the speakeasies in the 20s. So it's the hip bone is connected to the thigh bone, and you see all these worlds. I wouldn't say colliding, but coexisting very nicely for that era of wonderful nonsense, as it was called.
Yeah. Why did you pick the term jazz era instead of prohibition era or something else? Like, is there some tie specifically? I know we kind of just covered a little bit about this, but maybe dive deeper into why jazz stands out to be titled great.
Well, it was known as the Jazz Age.
Okay.
And well, I my memory fails me now, but there are often negotiations between authors and publishers on
Right.
even titles, let alone on subtitles. So I'm not quite sure whether I came up with Jazz Age in it or the publisher, but I will say that if you read the dedication of the book, which a lot of people skip over, it's dedicated to a fellow who works regularly in Manhattan, a guy named Vince Giordano. Vince Giordano fronts, as they say, not in a sinister way, but he leads a 11-piece, completely authentic jazz 1920s era jazz band.
Mm.
Okay, and I have enjoyed so many nights listening to him and his crew. And he might be the best in the current Martin Scorsese movie, that Flower Moon movie.
Yeah.
There are a couple numbers played by his band in that. He's been in The Aviator. He's a Grammy-winning musician. So the connection between jazz and the 1920s, this is when George Gershwin, comes up with Rhapsody in Blue at the drop of a hat. At the drop of a hat, they say, "Oh, we need something for the program. Can you compose something?" And it's like, I don't have anything today, but in a couple of weeks, and there's this masterpiece. I mean, it was also an age of genius creativity in terms of literature and journalism and music. And that's where The Great Gatsby is written. When it's written by F. Scott Fitzgerald, we have his name in the book, and one of the characters in his book is a guy named Meyer Wolfsheim, who is based on the aforementioned Mr. Arnold Rothstein.
Arnold makes it into a lot of fiction, right? He's a great real life character.
He is in Boardwalk Empire. He was a central character, even though in real life Boardwalk Empire, I don't know how often he went down to Atlantic City or interacted with Nucky Johnson, the boss of Atlantic City, the central character in that book. But Nucky Johnson shows up in this book, and he shows up because of one of his showgirl girlfriends, and he's supporting her. And we see a couple of themes in the book, which are also themes of, when you watch TCM, Turner Classic Movies, and you watch these pre-code movies from the early 30s, and you see a couple of plot points all the time. You see like Gold Diggers of 1933. So you see the Showgirls, and there are a lot of showgirl girlfriends to rich, well-connected guys. Some of them are gangsters, like Legs Diamond or Waxy Gordon, or they may be sort of respectable, like Mayor Walker or William Randolph Hearst or Arnold Rothstein. And then you see another plot point in these films, which is jewel robberies. You always see, John Barrymore is trying to rob Greta Garbo's jewels in Grand Hotel, or maybe William Powell is trying to rob Kay Francis's in another movie, etc., etc. And you say, well, that's just some Hollywood hokum or something. They're beating this to death. But in fact, there were jewel robberies all the time. And the wife of one of the more famous jewel robbers at the time said, this guy stole like $10 million worth of jewels over his career, which wasn't over at the time she wrote this, and fenced $1 million of these jewels with Arnold Rothstein. Some of his bodyguards were jewel robbers on the time. And you see a couple of showgirls whose jewels were insured because Rothstein ran an insurance agency by Arnold Rothstein. And then these women end up robbed and murdered. And so Arnold Rothstein would have known where the jewels were in these cases. I'm not saying
Yeah,
anything,
yeah,
definitely, but eh,
yeah. I don't know the story about Rhapsody in Blue. Do you have more detail on that? I mean, obviously I know the song, I know Gershwin and everything, but
yeah,
I
there
didn't
were.
realize it was a moment of singular moment of genius and a
It
genius
was
year.
Paul Whiteman was presenting this. Who was a big. I mean, he was a big fat guy. Okay, and he was the big sort of jazz band leader in the 20s. Often he'd have like different Paul Whiteman bands playing in Manhattan, and he'd flip from one site to another in the course of a night, waving his baton, and that's how big and popular he was. And they were planning this concert at Aeolian Hall. I think which was the Aeolian Company made pianos,
Yeah.
and so they had a hall like Carnegie Hall, and he was booked to showcase jazz music, and he had advertised that Gershwin was going to write something for him, and it was incredibly short notice, and Gershwin just went to work on it immediately, and it just took off like crazy on that and became his signature piece. Um, you could hear Vince Giordano do like a 11 man version of this. I mean, there's all sorts of versions, and there are shortened versions of it, and full concert versions, and it's just taken off like that. But I mean, Gershwin was just an amazing guy, and I wish we heard him more in grocery stores instead of the stuff which is playing in the background today. But maybe that's just me.
Yeah, yeah. Well, no, I could take some more Gershwin for sure in my
Yeah,
life, and I don't even know if I can hear my hearing is all shot, so I don't even I don't even. I'm trying to pay attention to voices, let alone some horn based thing. It's interesting. I had a guy on the show named Sammy Nestico. He's passed on. He was born in the 20s, and well, he wrote for everybody. He wrote for and played with Duke Ellington, Quincy Jones. These are the names of things that people he did. But his lead instrument, like Tommy Dorsey and a few other guys that era, was the trombone. And because there is a piano, but there isn't an electric guitar or other way to write music. And so someone like Gershwin, I don't know what Gershwin's home instrument was, but
piano,
it is piano. Okay, but you
piano.
have this brass
You
sensibility.
can,
Yeah,
because they had player pianos still in vogue then.
yeah,
Okay, before mass media kind of killed that form of home entertainment when you
hmm
had to play it yourself. You can still buy player piano rolls which were recorded by George Gershwin. So you could have in your home
hmm
really George Gershwin playing on your piano.
Isn't that
I
crazy?
mean, how chills. I'm getting chills
Yeah,
thinking about it.
yeah, yeah. It's amazing.
Ironically, I think when they were going to record it for the first time, like in a real record, he wasn't available, and they brought in a guy named Oscar Levant. If you're ever familiar with him,
Yeah,
fascinating figure, uh, a major concert pianist in the 30s, 40s, and then in the 50s, he was a very acerbic kind of weird guy. He was in fact institutionalized towards the end of his life several times. He would go on the Jack Parr show and would uh, almost fresh out of the institution and on not quite live TV, but it was quite the thing to see if you were a kid like me, this fellow where you didn't know what he would come out with, but he was brilliant. He
yeah.
was not only a great pianist, but he was a great wit. You see him like the sidekick in the movies.
hmm
In the movie, the George Gershwin story, when they made a movie of Gershwin's life, he plays Oscar Levant,
Yeah.
the sidekick, and he's like, one of these, like I say, acerbic kind of very urban kind of guys. And he's also Gene Kelly's sidekick in American in Paris. American
Right.
in
I
Paris,
know exactly what you're talking about. He plays the piano.
another,
Yeah.
exactly, another Gershwin based film.
Yeah.
So
Yeah.
we're kind of going all around the lot here, but I don't mind. I don't mind.
Yeah.
This is because this is my neighborhood.
Yeah, yeah. Well, so I don't know if you know Chris Thomas King's work. He's a blues musician now, but he also wrote a history of the blues. And a lot of those musicians were just starting to get recorded. And that means they're going to
Yes,
Chicago, they're going to New York. And these are the true blues musicians, and jazz with two S's instead of two
yes,
C's.
yes.
These things are all really the same thing. And guys like Jelly Roll Morton end up in New York City and have these smoking hot bands that are, because this was dance music. This was, blue, like Sacra Blue. That's one of the things that Chris talks about. Is like this is a rejection of, it's like a counterculture movement, from how he
It
tells
is,
his.
and it catches on so very quickly.
Yeah.
Um, there are in jazz, you see a lot of classic white bands then, but of course, then you've still got Louis Armstrong. You
Yeah.
can visit Louis Armstrong's home in Queens, of all places, this day. There's like a Louis Armstrong Jazz Center, and Fats Waller has a
Uh-huh.
show which is backed by Arnold Rothstein. Okay, and
See?
that's in the book,
Yeah.
and on East or West 63rd Street. That's also the theater which housed the production called Sex, which was produced, directed, starring Mae West, and
Oh,
that's how the censors ended up raiding the place. And Mae West ended up for a few days in the workhouse in the women's penitentiary in New York City for being raided. But the publicity was wonderful. It was worth it.
yeah. Yeah. In the book, you break a lot of things up by location because it is, and you say it on here,
It is,
intuitive.
yeah.
Yeah. Why did you use that story device, the location based?
Well, because how the book came about is that in just before the book was written, I was asked to do a radio interview out of New York.
Hmm.
And the fellow was doing the shows out of the Russian tea room. And he says, "Could you talk about Arnold Rothstein on Broadway and Times Square?" And it's like, yes, I can. And the reason I was able to say, yes, I can so quickly is because right after the Rothstein book came out, I was asked to do a walking tour physically
Hmm.
of Times Square and Rothstein. And I still had all my notes. So it was just go back and I could actually find my notes, which was the miracle.
Yeah.
And did that. By the way, I was hired to do this walking tour, and it was stiffed on the payment for it. So always in Times Square, keep your hand on your wallet.
Yeah.
But so I thought, well, I could do a little booklet on this, and I tend to get carried away. So the booklet turned into a real live book. And so the format was the tour, was the geography of it. And so we just went on from there and expanded it. So if it was someone who had touched upon Rothstein in some way, I had that guidepost.
Hmm.
And you could find out in the newspapers now, which are online. Newspapers are kind of shy about giving addresses now. The media was not shy about it then. So I had all the addresses, not only the street numbers,
Yeah.
but also sometimes the apartment numbers. I came across a guidebook online recently, and it was like just for tourists or something, written about 1920 or so.
Hmm.
And it listed Franklin D. Roosevelt's home address. Oh, if you want to walk by Franklin D. I mean, who
Yeah.
the hell was Franklin D. Roosevelt back
Right.
then?
Right.
Failed vice presidential candidate, but
Yeah.
whatever. They had his, they knew where he was.
Yeah. It's funny because I've got a newspapers.com subscription, and you can just get lost in those things for
You
hours. And
can.
you'll read the thing and be like, little David Pietrusza played baseball and won the Little League, for whatever thing. And he lives at 123 Arbor Way, and you're
Mm,
like, he's a little kid. You're putting his
no,
address in the paper. You
my
couldn't do that today.
let's just say my family was not in the social register,
Yeah.
but I mean, there's stuff where I just saw it yesterday that my mother was hosting a party for
All the time.
sorority in high school at
Yeah.
161 Church Street, Amsterdam, New York,
Yeah.
which was where she lived with her aunt above the bar, you
Yeah.
know, and that was in the paper.
Yeah.
Yeah. I mean, it was different world, different world.
Totally different world. Yeah. When you see like the article about some girl getting feted, or some Boy Scout with his project, and they put their home address, like you would
Yeah.
never do that.
Or my relatives were holding a party for the name day of
Oh,
one other relative, not the birthday,
right. The name
but
day.
the Catholic name day. I
Yeah.
mean, that level. They must have had a great stringer network in the
Yeah.
neighborhoods.
Yeah. Yeah. It really was local news. Hey, you mentioned Primo Carnera, the champ, and also you've got Jack Dempsey in this book.
Yes. Well, because Jack Dempsey was the his loss to Gene Tunney
Hmm.
was, maybe mobbed up. I mean, it was certainly a strange situation, and then the long count as well. Dempsey may have been, poisoned before the fight, and then he has the famous Jack Dempsey restaurant in New York City, right in Times Square. So we're able to pinpoint where that was. I actually have for my father's home movie, like about 1/8 of a second, because back in home movies back then, they'd be like nobody focused on anything
Yeah.
like
Right.
on your Apple iPhone. you know so yeah, he was in Times Square. Another boxer, of course, who is central to this narrative, is Abe Attell, who was a lightweight featherweight boxing champion. He ran a well, he was one of the guys who helped Arnold Rothstein fix the 1919 World Series. Later on, he shortly thereafter, I wonder where he got the money from. He founded a shoe store, women's shoe store, which he said business was great, but then oddly enough, arson struck.
No.
Arson struck, and there were like a watchman found like rags, oily rags in the stairwell at that point, but nothing to see here. And by the way, the watchman was the watchman from the establishment in the basement of that building, which was a speakeasy.
Oh. Yeah. It's a we don't know these things because it's 100 years ago. But if you spend time reading newspapers, and everything, a lot of the entertainment was very, very local. Everybody had great bands around them because you didn't really have records and record players. Yes, some people owned them, but that was just very new, right? And then also, the sports was hyper local. There were local fighters and regional champions and
Oh yeah, like the St.
yeah,
Nicholas Arena,
hmm,
places like that. In on Madison Square Garden wasn't the only game in town.
right.
There were a bunch like this, and of course there were, three major league teams in New York City, but also all the semi-pro teams, et cetera, et cetera.
Yeah. And really, prize fighting was about, I don't know, 40 years old at that point, like legitimately. I mean, it was in the 1890s, it started to become a thing where you could legitimately get a license and make money fighting people. And so
Yeah,
it's not
yeah.
that pure of a
Oh,
sport.
Jack Dempsey. There's a connection. There's another connection to him. One of his earliest managers was a guy named John the Barber Reisler,
Right.
who I came across actually because it was like there was a thing in one of these papers about Arnold Rothstein getting his hair cut there. But Reisler was also a witness to the Herman Rosenthal murder, which
Mm,
was a murder committed or organized by a New York City police lieutenant who went to the chair. And then Reisler is like, "Yeah, I saw it." And then it's like, "No, I didn't see anything. No, I didn't see anything." And then they said, we'll prosecute you for
Absolutely.
perjury. And it's like, oh well, I guess I did see it. But also then he got a well, he was later raided for having booze in his barber shop. But before that, uh he had a girlfriend. And he had a wife. And the wife had a sister who was the girlfriend of the husband. And the wife was not too happy about her far more attractive sister taking up with her husband. And neither were the Reislers' kids. And so one day they went to the girlfriend's home in Brooklyn and just shot her dead. And the Mrs. Reisler said to the kids, save one shot for the old witch. And the old witch was her own mother.
Oh my God.
And they were willing to kill her. But in any case, they killed, you know, her sister in front of their mother. And so it was not always a wholesome attitude. The
Yeah.
son, by the way, who pulled the trigger, was sent to prison and was pardoned by Governor Franklin D. Roosevelt.
No kidding.
Yeah.
That's funny. We're talking about Gangsterland. This is David's latest book. I'm going to put the link right down below here by John's face.
Okay.
It's also in the remarks. You know, I always say, buy two,
Yeah.
do a buddy read. Read with somebody else. So,
Yeah.
yeah, it's
And
cool.
they give it a 5-star review.
Yeah, go on
Yeah.
Amazon, 5-star review this thing, and you're not going to regret it. There are so many great names that we know about from history in this thing, like this page after page, and it's really consumable. I got the book the other day. I haven't gotten all the way through it, but I'm a lot of the way into it. And there's just so many fascinating names that you don't know about. So who did you discover? Look, okay, there's Jack Dempsey, and there's Frank.
Well, this Reisler guy was quite the discovery. And then there was a big Rothstein had at the end of his life, he was moving into the drug trade.
Mm,
I mean, to the extent of millions of 1929 real live gold backed dollars. And a couple of his henchmen there were Sidney Stager, who was a boyfriend friend. I knew about him. And then there was another guy who named George Uffner. And Uffner stayed in the mob for decades afterwards. He was a film distributor salesman at first, and then wandered into the orbit of the drug trade. He had one of these showgirl girlfriends who won a beauty contest sponsored by the the infant New York Daily News, and was given a role in a motion picture at Paramount Studios, the Astoria Studios, because back then, they had a silent movie studio in Astoria, Queens. Then they shut it down, and then when talkies came in, they opened it back up. So we learned about them and their various peccadillos,
yeah,
but also in regard to the drug trade, not directly, but I learned about a guy named George Ringler, and I learned about him from one of his blood relatives. Ringler was a blood relative of Arnold Rothstein, and so this person was as well, which was not easy tracking these folks down.
yeah.
Ringler was a photographer for the New York Daily News and a very close friend of Mayor Walker. When Mayor Walker goes up to New York or to Albany to face the music with Governor Roosevelt, he takes Ringler with him. But Ringler was also the only Caucasian who was a member or head of a member of a Chinese tong.
Hmm,
Tongs were like trade associations
yeah,
or maybe, just maybe, illegal, criminal
yeah,
organizations, depending on who you listen to. And so it's the speculation is there that maybe Ringler was able to be smooth the way for Rothstein's henchmen to go to the Orient and bring back some illegal drugs like heroin and stuff like that. Although a lot of the stuff, a lot of the junk, as they say, that they were bringing back was actually from Europe. But
Yeah.
it was when he dies, there are raids by the feds, and it is in the amounts of millions of dollars of stuff seized.
Is this when Rothstein dies, you're saying?
This
Or
is when Rothstein
yeah,
dies.
yeah, yeah,
When
yeah.
Rothstein is shot dead, one of the early interviewers said, "Hey, what are the places you can go to and still see, what they were like, as opposed to, well, they tore down Lindy's and now it's an office building,
Yeah.
which in the 40s and 50s happens a lot. So you see a number of the theaters still remain, but where Rothstein was killed at the Park Central Hotel near to Carnegie Hall, you can still visit that hotel. I uh, I shot a, local New York City public access TV show there once, and went up and down the stairwells where he was, sort of bleeding to death, and we're able to see that, or the apartment where he lost $300,000 in a big poker game, and that which led to his death, or visit Sardi's, a functioning place, which you can still see what it was like in those days, is the famous showbiz restaurant Sardi's, which I didn't see, well, a direct connection to these gangsters, but they had the most famous hat check girl in hat check girldom history. And she had previously worked at Texas Guinan's speakeasies, where she had interacted with Arnold Rothstein. Now, why was she so famous, this hat check girl? Not because she was, particularly hot stuff, but because she was pretty smart up here.
Okay.
And they would producers and actors would drop off scripts and screenplays with her, and they'd say, should we develop this movie, should we develop this play, should I act in this play?
Yeah.
And they respected her opinion so much that over the course of the years, she reviewed 5,000 of these things. She actually had a radio show at this point.
Jeez.
So the stuff you asked, this, who do you
Yeah.
come up with that you never heard of before, really surprised you? And this woman was one of them. Yeah.
I'd never heard of the Oracle of Sardes. That's
No, no.
that's amazing. Yeah, that's incredible. So when you're touring us all around the area, how close is Rothstein to any Roosevelt or to Hoover or any of these other
Not
characters?
to
Since
these guys, not
well
to
far
these
apart.
guys, but
Yeah.
certainly to the well, I guess one degree of separation
Hmm.
would be to um, his best man,
Mm.
Herbert Bayard Swope, is his best man in Saratoga Springs when Rothstein gets married there during the racing season.
Hmm.
Swope is a newspaper man at that time. He also ends up owning a racing stable, and he becomes editor in chief of the New York World, which in the 20s was the prestige newspaper, not the Times. Not that the Times was chopped liver, but the World was, the one the really smart people read. I think he won the first Pulitzer Prize for journalism,
Mm.
and was actually one of the reasons why Breen Z. Rosenthal, who I mentioned, was killed by that cop, because Rosenthal was spilling his guts to the papers in the form of Swope. So, but Swope rather at some point becomes an advisor. Once the world goes bust, he becomes an advisor to, statesmen like Roosevelt and Truman and people like that. So there's your one degree of separation.
Yeah.
And of course, to Tammany Hall, which is busted up by Franklin Rose, in part busted up by Roosevelt
Right.
and Fiorello LaGuardia, because there's a loan which is uncovered after Rothstein's death from Rothstein to a judge named Vitale, And Vitalis is forced off the magistrate's court's bench, which leads to a big investigation of the magistrate's court system, the justice court system, which was the key to protecting all these speakeasies and crooks.
Huh.
Because they'd bring a case and against the speakeasies, and then they would get thrown out of court,
Right.
either by the judge himself or his clerk had the power to throw these cases out. So if the clerk does it, oh, my clerk did it. I didn't do it. Vote for me. I didn't take any money. There's nothing in my pocket here. No.
Yeah.
Um, so there's one phase of the investigation. Then they start looking at other people who are like sheriffs and clerks and commissioners in the New York City governmental system.
Yeah.
If you remember, or probably don't, around 1961, there was a Broadway show called Fiorello! Exclamation point, and it starred Tom Bosley, okay, from Happy Days, the
Yeah.
father, okay. So he was the Fiorello LaGuardia who became mayor of New York, and it had a song in that called A Little Tin Box. And it was, oh, a little tin box, a little tin box with your little tin key unlocks. And it was based on testimony where a Senate or a Sheriff Farley, they said, how did you amass all this money in your bank account on such a small salary? And he said, oh, I would bring my lunch to work each day and put the money I saved into a little tin box, and it all added up.
Yeah.
It was a marvelous tin box. You bet it was. But so after that, they moved on to Mayor Walker.
Yeah.
He was thrown out. And Tammany essentially collapsed. They were at its peak at this point. They had just nominated or helped to nominate the Democratic candidate for president of the United States with Al Smith. And then they fall right off the cliff. And Roosevelt ends up, putting federal patronage through the ostensibly Republican, but really as rhino as it gets, Fiorello LaGuardia in the 30s, and starving patronage from Tammany Hall.
The when you talk about all of the leaders and the proximity, with the machines, probably through sports as well, and the mobs and the courts, you see all of this. I don't want to call it corruption because it's just a system of getting things done. We may call it corruption easily, but is that any better than we are now? Do you think? Like, we now we don't pay judges as often as we did back then, but we pick a judge.
I don't think the payoffs are there.
Right.
It's not
But
like
no one's
that.
going broke in Congress.
Certainly without prohibition,
Yeah.
you don't have those opportunities. And you, even before prohibition, you'd have opportunities with, say, Sunday closing laws, or staying open late, and the cops would look the other way, and the judges and all that. But I have two quotes, and the editor said, take one of them out. You're just sort of repeating things.
Yeah.
There are two quotes from Tammany leaders. One is a Judge Nathan Birkin, who was a big copyright lawyer and entertainment lawyer, but also one of the big shots in Tammany. And there's another quote from a guy named Little Tim Sullivan, who was the leader on the city council from the Lower East Side. And both of them are saying how, we help people. We help people all the time. And we're not like these reformers who come around, the week before election day, and you never see him again. And, if some guy's got a problem, or his brother-in-law has his problem, or you need the turkey at Thanksgiving Day, or a bucket of coal, we're there.
Yeah.
And we're sort of the welfare system and the ombudsman system. which existed, and worked very well. Now, of course, there were fringe benefits to doing that,
Yes.
often very, very lucrative, but they would get that done that way. One of the stories about Tammany Hall was one of their most powerful and smartest and best leader, best because he never got caught, was a guy named Charles Francis Murphy. And he was very silent, never said a word to just about anybody. And what he would do is he would stand around on a street corner in his district, like under a lamppost, and you'd know to find him at a certain hour, at a certain day. And even though he was one of the most powerful guys in the city, anyone could come up to him and with a problem and say, "I need your help."
Yeah.
And try to try to get try to find Charles Schumer or Hakeem Jeffries on a street corner and approach him for help nowadays.
Yeah.
It's not going to happen.
No. Too many people in between.
There's too much staff, and it's too
Yeah.
big and all that. But it
Yeah.
evidently wasn't too big for those guys.
Yeah.
And if you're smart, you keep doing it. And you're I was a city councilman for a while, and you had to be accessible. I mean, it's a hell of a responsibility. Actually, you realize that it's not all about your power. Also, you find out in legislative terms, it's the power is pretty limited, but the responsibilities aren't.
Yeah. When you are, look, this is an accidental book that you came across, but you've written about presidents and gangsters and baseball and all these things. Is there a favorite character? Is it Rothstein? Who is the central character of this thing? Rothstein doesn't make it out of the 20s alive, so
Well, you know who keeps showing up? I don't know if I'd call her a favorite character, but who keeps showing up in all the presidential election histories. Okay. And I've done 1920, 1932, 1936, 1948, 1960. And she shows up in each one, and not just in one sentence, is Eleanor Roosevelt.
Oh, okay.
Okay. Eleanor is alive and kicking through all of them, including the 1960 election, where she does not care for John Fitzgerald Kennedy at all at the beginning, in part because she remembers Joe Kennedy.
Is that Joe's fault? Yeah.
And Joe and John F. Kennedy is at that point not regarded as any big liberal by Democratic standards. Her heart is still pining for Adlai Stevenson the third.
Yeah.
And so she doesn't like, and nor is her family very big on Harry Truman in 1948. I mean, there's the famous story about how Truman, says right after FDR dies, "Is there anything I can do for you, Mrs. Roosevelt?" And she says, "Oh, no, I don't need you any help. You're the one who's in trouble now, Harry."
Yeah. I love that line. Back to Rothstein, just because he is he's the kind of character we love, right? But here he is, he's a murderer, he's a thief, Why do we love our gangsters so much here?
Well, he's so smart and so accomplished, and so with his fingers in every pie, that he's far more interesting than the good guys of this era. Who remembers the U.S. attorney for the Southern District Tunnel at this point? No, nobody. Or even District Attorney Whitman, it's the attorney who gets the conviction in the Rosenthal murder. We don't remember these guys. And he's connected to such fascinating things like speakeasies and Broadway shows and baseball.
Yeah.
So his connectivity to everything just go, point of direction, and he's there.
Yeah.
And also we kind of, because there's not many photographs and no film or recordings of his voice, we can imagine him what we want him to be. It's sort of like the miracle of the golden age of radio. You're
Yeah.
creating all the scenery and all that with just a few, sound effects and your imagination.
Yeah. Yeah. It's an interesting thing to think about with that. Uh, you have the other people that have the corruption thing down well. Like we know that Chester Arthur, was given the cookie of the New York Customs House, but we don't really track anybody after that. Like nobody ever cheated again at the customs.
Well, they reformed everything, of
Oh,
course.
of course, yes, yeah.
Well, yeah, Chester Arthur. I've actually spoken at his grave,
Oh, have
and,
you really?
and may do so again next year. Yeah, he
No
was.
kidding.
He's interesting because aside from the lucrativeness, when people would, public officials could not always operate on a sort of commission system that at that
Mm,
time and afterwards. Al Smith leaves the New York State Assembly in the teens, and he had been speaker at one time. Okay, so and in any case, he would have been minority leader. He
mhm.
leaves to become sheriff of Manhattan, of Kings County. Okay, and why does he do that? Because with all the process serving and all the stuff like that, he would get a cut. I mean, it wasn't graft or anything, but his salary wasn't that good, but his income was fabulous at that point. And it was sort of like it must have been hard for him to leave that and then run for governor in 1918. But power has its own charms. So when
Yeah,
you're in that business, and that's why he takes over the Empire State Building when it's being built, because he needs the money because he didn't seem to be on the take as much as James J. Walker and company.
yeah. The do you believe the dying words story of Rothstein? Does he really say "me mutter did it" and all
I
that?
don't. It doesn't quite sound like him. It doesn't quite sound like him. But he certainly didn't talk.
Right.
Um, which is there was a case where he was robbed maybe 10 years before one of his poker games or card game or craps games, and he was very reluctant to talk on that, and I think Swope had to convince him to do it,
Mm,
and then he did it. But there's that sort of gangland code of honor that we're not going to we'll settle our own
yeah.
scores. But it may also have been for a couple of reasons. One was the shooting an accident. It,
Oh, okay.
it seems to be that something happened and he pushed the gun away or it went off. And well, it's like I get asked in an interview. So that was a professional mob hit, right? Absolutely not.
Mm,
And why can I say this with such confidence? Because if I'm a professional killer, if I'm like with Murder Incorporated
yeah.
after the Rothstein era, I don't shoot a man once. I don't shoot him in the gut. I don't allow him to wander out of the room and down the stairway
Yeah.
to be picked up by the police and put in an ambulance and sent to a hospital and to linger for a few days
Right.
only to kill because of to die because of the infection.
Yeah.
I blow his head off
Right.
several times. So it was not a professional hit. It was by someone who was like, and then throws the gun out the window through a screen onto Seventh Avenue. Um, but I like the the very documented last words of Dutch Schultz
Hmm.
after he's bumped off at a steakhouse in Jersey City, where he's just it's like some crazy beat poetry, rhyme of consciousness, and it's like, wow, this guy could have had a career as the
Hmm.
next Allen Ginsberg or something, but yeah, well, a lot of these guys simply are rubbed out, or legs Diamond, who
Yeah.
is rubbed out very near to where I am right now in Albany, New York. But he was the human clay pigeon. They kept trying to kill him, and then they
Who
could.
was that?
Legs Diamond.
Oh, okay, yeah.
Yeah, yeah.
Uh, yeah, there's so many of these characters that I want to bring up, but like you have Babe Ruth, who's in the 20s, and when we talk about the greatness of Babe Ruth, we try to put it in a modern setting so we can understand. But you just talked about Rothstein dying from an infection, and President Harding's son dying from a blister
Oh
from
no,
playing tennis.
President Coolidge.
Coolidge, right?
Yeah,
Coolidge, right?
and
Because
frankly, I try not to share details of my own health, but
yeah,
it's because of knowing a lot about Calvin Coolidge and how the son died.
yeah,
After a while, the blister, they said the doctor says, "Oh, gee, look at these white stripes on his foot. That
yeah.
means it's an infection." And recalling that, oh, a year ago now, I smashed my finger when a window fell on it and really hurt it like crazy and opened it up. And then I noticed the next day when I was trying to buy something to, just put like a bandage or to
Yeah,
cushion that there were these white stripes on my finger.
yeah,
And I ended up going to a urgent care place just to get
yeah,
some antibiotics because otherwise, otherwise I might have just, oh, I'm a
yeah,
guy. I don't deal with these things. It'll heal itself.
yeah,
Yeah, but I think that it could have gone very badly.
yeah. And I guess my thing is when we put people from that era in the modern context, maybe they would or maybe they wouldn't compete as well. But if you take a kid and have him be born in 1895, like Babe Ruth, and you have his parents be not really able to take care of it, either raised in an orphanage or in a bar, there's no antibiotics. The,
No.
the common diet is grain, lard, and more lard. And these guys didn't, even if they didn't get rubbed out, they didn't live easy and they didn't live long, no matter what they did.
No, it's pretty remarkable that Hoover lives for so long. And what well, look at how quickly Theodore Roosevelt goes,
Yeah. Yeah.
and Woodrow Wilson, certainly with the strokes and all that. These guys are um Theodore Roosevelt dies, I think, earlier. Well, Franklin Roosevelt too.
Yeah.
Franklin Roosevelt dies at age 62, and looks like hell.
Yeah.
Just looks like death warmed over. You see these pictures of him at Yalta. They had an exhibit on the 1944 election last year at Hyde
Yeah.
Park, where his home at the Presidential Library, and there is this giant blow up of him at Yalta between Churchill and Stalin, and seeing him life size with that expression on his face is horrifying.
Yeah. Yeah.
But also, while he's posing for this formal picture between the leaders of the free world, so to speak, including Joseph Stalin, he's dangling a cigarette behind his fingers.
Yeah.
If the polio don't kill you, the cigarettes will. And I think
Yeah.
that's what did him in as much as anything else. But then again, then you've got that miracle, that miracle of longevity, Winston Churchill,
Yeah.
who lives forever despite all the bad habits in the world.
Yeah.
Not just smoking those cigars, but I mean, was he an alcoholic? you could argue that,
Yeah, I don't see how you could say he wasn't. I mean, it appears that every time I read a book about him, he's hammered all the time, and he's
He's
drinking
hammered all the
massive,
time.
yeah,
Yeah,
massive amounts of alcohol,
yeah,
bottles, you know.
yeah.
And I've got a an author coming on, and he's written about all of like the ungentlemanly warfare and Churchill's fondness of sneaky bombs and infiltrations. His name is Giles. He'll be on next week, but it's amazing and Churchill showed up with De Gaulle or whoever was with him, what luminary or VIP, and they're both hammered. They're like,
De
watch
Gaulle,
watch my
too.
bomb guys, we're gonna blow things.
Gee. Well, Bomber, God knows what Bomber Harris was
Oh man,
imbibing at that time. It was our saturation bombing at that point was particularly the British.
yeah,
I mean, of course, the British had more of a personal reason to be upset at the Nazis than we did. We did, we were, our anger was, I think, 60-40 versus the Japanese.
yeah,
And because of Pearl Harbor, but with the Blitz and all that, the Germans were like, okay, you tried this with us, we're going to really blow the crap out of you.
yeah,
And they did without much effect on the war. I mean, it really was just sort of vengeance after a while. And well, 1944, the Germans produced more tanks than they did at any other point during the war. Their
yeah,
production goes up. And what we had, or what we, or the largely the British had done was, destroy a lot of houses and people, and in France too. They killed a lot of French civilians in their bombing policy.
yeah.
War is hell. It ain't
Oh
good.
boy. Yeah, some of these saboteurs, whether they were English or provisioned by the English, they would slow up a division's movement, or they would, kill someone in particular. The Nazis would come in and just reap the entire village.
They would. I mean, it was just, okay,
Yeah,
you kill one of our guys and we'll round up people, and maybe we'll put them in the church and then burn it to the ground with them in it.
yeah, yeah, gruesome. My thing stuck here. What are we doing here? There we go. Okay, sorry, I got my Wi-Fi got hung up a little bit. Anyhow, the book is called Gangsterland, and if David writes it, it's awesome. It's a good time. We just spent an hour talking about all these great moments. There are so many neat moments too, and the book is really short, little like vignette pieces, and so you can tear through this thing pretty fast. I highly recommend this. Get this book. Anything in closing before we wrap it up, David?
No, I think we've covered a multitude of topics, but all good, all good. And the thing about the book is, if you're afraid you're going to get lost in the geography of the book, there's a cast of characters at the beginning, so you can flip through and say, "Oh, that's what that guy did." And
Yeah,
also, because the book is geographical and its guts, there's a chronology at the back to tie things in and say, "Oh, this was going on at the same time,"
yeah,
and it's like, "Wow, this is mind blowing," and it
yeah.
really is. And also to let what happens to these people at the end, sort of like a little, epilogue.
Nice. And since this book wasn't even supposed to happen, it just got like, oops, I made a book. What's next?
Well, I'm not exactly sure. I was thinking maybe of doing some of these, maybe something shorter than full size books, and putting them out like as small ebooks. This
Yeah,
this occurred to me just the other day, so maybe like a fever, it will pass. I don't know. And I guess the correct answer is I don't know.
yeah, yeah. Flash forward 2 months and you'd be like, I'm back with the book, right? At
I'm
least that's how it's going to feel to
I
me.
was just kidding. I'm not retiring. I'm here.
Yeah. Are you really thinking about retiring?
Um, every so often, well, you talk about, you think about switching gears,
Yeah.
and for a while I was doing a bit more with ghostwriting,
Yep.
But sometimes then some of the offers you get to um, ghost a book, and it's like I don't think this is for me.
Yeah. Yeah.
It's like the money is there, but uh, damn it, I have standards.
Well, you've got to sit with that book. And do you want to write some wealthy person's book that they don't have time to write? Like, this is not interesting to me.
Well, no, sometimes the topic is interesting, or you could make it work, but other times you just say, no, I don't want to defend that position or
Yeah.
settle that score.
Right.
Yeah.
Right. Yeah. 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 All right. Well, let me roll these credits and I'll come right back to you and say goodbye to you.
Hey, thanks for watching the show. I really appreciate it. Right here, you can subscribe. Please do that. It makes the show grow. Hit that notification bell so you know which incredible guest is coming up next. Down below is the PayPal link. You can put a small subscription in. That is an enormous help. All that money goes right back into the show. And then right up over here are the next episodes you should listen to, curated by yours